Gave away everything on that one. Oh, how exciting.
All right.
Better not say anything funny.
People are still joining.
All right. Well, let me know when to get started.
Why don't we wait
Gatekeeper.
till a couple of more minutes? Okay, here. And I can keep on admitting people after we get going.
Okay.
Do you hear the ding when they?
Yes.
I keep hearing a ringing in my ears. Is that the computer?
Well, it's my computer, so
I know.
I should just look. I'm going to mute myself and not talk to you anymore. Okay.
Okay. That's interesting. Huh.
Unmute yourself, Michael.
We are now at 49. This is really wonderful.
Fantastic. Are we at 60? I don't have my,
It's
We're at-
it's 6:02.
okay. Well, shall we get started then?
Go for it.
All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody who is tuning in tonight. Thank you for joining us. We've obviously all been lamenting that we can't see our friends, see each other in person for these events, but if there was ever a night for staying in, this is certainly one of those. So thank you for joining us we are super excited to present for this, our last public meeting of the 50th anniversary year for the Canadian Historical Society. We are excited to present David Williams, author and everybody's favorite street smart naturalist, with a new and original presentation on his very astute observances of interactions of the natural world and human activity on, well, our entire region. If you've been fortunate enough to have the time to sit down and read his most recent book, Home Waters, there it is, about Puget Sound.
My mom says it's really good.
So without further ado, I will hand this over, but I do have a couple of requests for our guests here tonight. If you could go up to your upper right-hand view of your screen, set it to speaker view. Also, at the top of the screen, if you have some view options to hide the video panel, you can do that as well if you like. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our guest tonight, David Williams. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen, and thank you, Michael, both of you, and Marga for asking me to do this tonight. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I think this is the second or third time I've spoken to the Queen Anne group, and it's fun because I know that you all are engaged in this place and are interested deeply in the history of it. If you do have questions, I will certainly be happy to answer them at the end, but I also recommend that if you want to type them into the chat while the meeting's going on, that way you remember them at the end. It's always, to me, a nice way to sort of save questions. So let me tell you a little bit more about myself. I am a writer based in the Seattle area. I've lived here for most of my life, and I'm always interested in that intersection between people and place. How do we impact landscape, and how does landscape impact us? And we've done this through a variety of books over the years. This talk is sort of based on many of them, on the Street Smart Naturalist, as the title implies, Seattle Walks. Really my interest in spending time exploring and getting out there in the city. If for some reason questions come up after that I didn't answer, please feel free to email me at my email address here. And also, if you are interested, I have a weekly newsletter that comes out. It's free. You can sign up through geologywriter.com, which has all sorts of information about me. But let me just dive in to the story here. And I want to begin, as my website describes, Geology Writer, I want to begin with the geology, because that's really what interests me. And I think it's critical to understanding the story of Queen Anne. And so the story, of course, is a glacial story. This video here really, I think, does a nice job of exploring what's going on. This idea that roughly 20,000, 19,000 years ago, we start to get a sheet of ice moving south out of Canada into the area between the Cascades and the Olympic Mountains. And that ice moves down fairly at a decent clip, passes through Seattle, continues past Tacoma, past Olympia, and then it reaches its final point just a little bit south of Olympia. And at that point, it stalls for a little bit and then begins to retreat or melt back to the north. Probably, as it says here, probably about twice as fast, the melting, as the advance. In Seattle, it's about 3,000 feet thick. In Bellingham, 5,000 feet. Geologists know this information by rocks that were deposited on the side of the boulder, the side of the glacier, as they were pushed along, and you can sort of map that elevation is one way that they understand the depth, the thickness of that ice moving through here. And as it said, that as that ice came through, it depressed the landscape, and then when the ice retreated, the landscape basically bounced or rebounded back up. So roughly by about 15,500 years ago, thereabouts, the ice was out of the region and we have Puget Sound. So Puget Sound is a relatively young geological feature. So what did it do? What was the impact of that ice? There were several impacts. Probably the biggest were two, the creating of troughs here. And that means that as the ice moved across the land, water flowing underneath that ice excavated into the landscape below and created the big features that we have here, what we think of as Puget Sound, Lake Washington, Lake Sammamish. Those are carved by this water flowing underneath the ice. At the same time, the ice creates a series of flutes on the landscape. What you can see clearly in this map that's color-coded for elevation, red being high, green being low. And you can see that the ice acted like a big rake scraping across the land, creating this sort of furrowed or corrugated landscape of ridges and valleys, the hills of Seattle, the 7 hills of Seattle, and of course, the one we're interested in tonight, right here in the middle of Queen Anne. So the story is a glacial story that I'm going to tell, this idea of ice and water shaping the landscape, and then what was the impact of that ice and water on the land. And in addition to shaping the land, that ice, as it moved through, also deposited a series of materials. We've had, over the last 2 million years, about 7 periods of glaciation. So that is this older material. But this sort of typical hill of Seattle is an example of every hill in the city. So that if you cut open the hill, any hill in Seattle, the lower 1/2 to 1/3 roughly is this very fine-grained clay. On top of that is a layer of sand. And on top of that is the till, or the hard pan that we all know. And in essence, the hills of Seattle are big chocolate layer cakes, 2 layers thick with a nice layer of icing on top. And that is critical to understanding many of the things that happened in the city over time. In particular, what interests me, how has the landscape been shaped? How has the topography been altered? How have we through the history of Seattle, been able to create the city that we want, to modify the landscape, to make it suitable for what interests people here. One way this happens, we see and impacts the city, is through landslides. So this wonderful 1903 topographic map of Seattle, which shows Queen Anne, which we'll see again. What you can see is that if you're not familiar with a topographic map, I'm sure most of you are, but if not, where the lines are closer together, it's steeper. When they're further apart, it's flat. And so we all know that the top of Queen Anne is relatively flat. The sides are steep. And this blue here, this is the landslide zone around, landslide prone zone in Seattle. So Queen Anne has obviously had many landslides over time. This Seattle landslide study map just dots showing where landslides are. Queen Anne, as special as it is, as wonderful a place as it is, you're not unique in having landslides, having issues. Obviously, all over the city, we have landslides. They're a common feature. There's a quote from R.H. Thompson, the great city engineer, something to the effect of, going back to the time of which man's memory does not extend, landslides have been occurring in Seattle. Basically, since the end of the Ice Age, we've been having landslides in this area. So that's a central feature to the story of Seattle. Then that connects to the street trolleys. And one thing that really interests me, and as Maureen said, I'm always interested in thinking about history and the natural world and how they intersect. Where do they interfinger? And to me, the trolleys are just one sort of small, nifty example of this. So this Port Commission map from 1918 shows the trolley system, and of course the famous ones going up and down. But what's important for me in my story is not what the trolley system used to look like, but what happened to the trolley system. And by 1940, the trolley system had been ripped up around the city. It had been removed and replaced with the electric buses that we have. Again, almost most of the places where you see a bus route that's a trolley bus route, the modern trolleys, those follow the historic routes of the trolleys. Go to Capitol Hill, you see that, Queen Anne, you see the same thing. But what I like about them is what happened once that street trolley system was ripped up in one of the early recycling projects in Seattle, reduce, reuse, is they took the street trolleys and used the materials. So the green here are the trolleys. These cement blocks, or the way the trolleys were anchored into the street system. They used those to make retaining walls around Seattle. So we can see the classic example with the trolleys. Then we also see ones where they've been slightly modified and they don't actually have the trolley lines anymore on them. You also find them sometimes use the old trolley tracks on stairways and also on railings along the stairway. You may be familiar with this route on the east side of Queen Anne, this sort of sketchy path that goes up the east side from Aurora up, that you can see along here. These are all street trolley rails that hold up, anchor that trail. So to me, I think that's just a wonderful connection between that human story and the natural history story that's still going on, that we still experience. Sadly, at least with the stairways, many of those have been removed over time, understandably replaced with higher quality stairs, but it's still part of the story. Also part of the story are retaining walls. My friend Austin Watson, who's on the show, hi Austin, on this talk, was kind enough to send me a series of photos on a walk he did around Queen Anne. And what struck me is Queen Anne has an incredible array of retaining walls. It's like people cannot figure out what to do or how to do it, or they use whatever is here. That's because of that topography. That's because of the geology, that concern of holding up the walls. And you have this incredible range across the city, but also in particular exemplified on Queen Anne Hill. And my favorite one is this photo Austin sent me, when I first saw it, I thought it was a door into the hillside, and I'm sort of disappointed it's not a door into some crazy garage back on a hillside. But I just love this big, beautiful retaining wall. Again, it's that intersection of the geological world and the human world that we have. Excuse me 1 second. So let's go back to our hillside. Let's go back to our typical hill, because there's an additional aspect of the story. And it does get back to the landslides. But part of that story is that when it rains in Seattle, and this is, we're obviously experiencing it now, water percolates down through the sand. It's a very permeable layer. But as it percolates down, it eventually hits that layer of clay, the Lawton clay, which is basically an impermeable layer. And that's where most of our landslides occur, because that layer gets sort of, in essence, gets sort of greased and becomes weaker and allows for landslides to occur. So that's a dominant area around here, around Queen Anne, where you see the landslides. But you have a secondary feature, and that is the seeps that are associated with that layer, that boundary there, because as water percolates down, hits the clay layer, it has nowhere to go except to follow gravity and follow gravity out to the surface. And I'm sure you've spent time walking around the city, and Queen Anne, and you may think of yourselves as a little city there, Queen Anne, and notice the seeps. Some of them, like this one on the north side of the hill, where water is just constantly gushing out. Others are more subtle. You often, where it's maybe it's just a little drip, it's a little wet spot, you see it, say you're walking along, particularly in the summer, I think is when they stand out most. It hasn't rained, and yet the street is wet, and it's probably not a pipe that burst. It's most likely one of these springs. And even though we like to think that we have somehow stopped the geology, that we have somehow capped the geology, we don't ever stop it. The geologic processes are always occurring and always finding that little zone of weakness and rising to the surface. One way to notice seeps around here are the plants. This previous shot with the horsetails here, here's a wonderful example of the horsetails. Skunk cabbage is another plant you see, and one of my favorites, the Opopanax horridus, or the devil's club. Anytime you see those plants, you should assume that there are seeps there, that there's some geologic phenomenon that is producing water that is year-round and allows plants like this to live in that area. The seeps then coalesce, come together to form streams. And there are, of course, streams everywhere in Seattle. I, a couple years ago, put together a list of 48 named streams or creeks in the city. The biggest drainage is Thornton Creek up here in the north. The earliest named one is Longfellow Creek down in West Seattle. Another aspect of springs, and you get a little bit of this in Queen Anne with Ward Springs. Springs, of course, were early water sources for the city. Spring Street in downtown Seattle comes from a spring that provided water. So these would have been important water sources. The other aspect, of course, of streams in the landscape is how it plays out with the plants that are there. A different array of plants are able to take advantage of that stream environment and persist and grow in the landscape. And to me, that's, again, that intersection of not the geologic world and the human world, but the geological world and the botanical world. And I'm always interested, again, in those connections of the land. Then there's one curious feature on the hill here, and I was reading about this and learned about this from Bill LaPrade, who wrote the wonderful Geological Introduction. If you all don't have this book, I'm sure all of you have it. But Bill talks about this canyon right here, or this ravine on the northeast side of the city. I keep calling it city, Queen Anne. And we can see this as we fade to the modern view, this ravine right here, this is as deep as it was. Bill says it went back as far almost to Newton Street. So a lot of this area has been filled in. There used to be a bridge that crossed at Boston Street. One of the reasons is that the geologic features, the seeps, the relationship between the sand and the clay and the till, all of that conspired to create this ravine on this landscape. It's not it's not just there randomly, it's there because of the geological landscape. And it's something that then we have altered over time, filled in the landscape. Another water feature that I think is sort of fun, and we see this throughout Seattle, is the location of the water towers on Seattle Hills. The top of West Seattle, Magnolia, Capitol Hill, Maple Leaf, all of them have water towers at the high points of the hill. And there's a reason, is that all of the hills in Seattle top out about 450 to 500 feet above sea level. And our source of water is out in the Cedar River or the Tolt rivers. Both those areas are higher in elevation than any point in Seattle. So our system, water system, is a gravity-fed water system. Water starts higher, flows down, and then is able to come back up to the tops of these hills. So it's a good way to find the high point of a hill, is to find where the water towers are. Again, that connection between the natural world and the human world. People recognize that the towers are there, the water towers, so that the water is a little bit higher and there's enough pressure to allow water to flow down to people's houses. So it's all connected, that story of the water, the geology, and houses in the city. But Queen Anne almost didn't exist. Maybe that's sort of an overstatement, but with the building of the Lake Washington Ship Canal, as it was being designed, as they were trying to figure out exactly where to put it, curiously, the Ballard men, as they say, these are the people who operated the mills and in the Salmon Bay area, were a little bit annoyed with what was going on. They didn't want it exactly as it was being planned. And so they actually proposed that you could actually just wash Queen Anne Hill into Lake Union, fill in Lake Union, then you wouldn't have any problem at all. So there was an attempt. It was a minor attempt. It was sort of a Seattle attempt. Big talk, nothing happens. We see that a lot in projects here, this proposal to wash away Queen Anne Hill. So you all are lucky where you're where you're at, and they didn't wash it away like they did to our fair Denny Hill, which is here called Denny and Furman Hill. So I want to turn away from the sort of the glacial story of Seattle, because those all tie to the glacial story. And I want to talk about a big love of mine, and that is building stone. How do people use stone as a building material? And this story starts on June 6, 1889, downtown Seattle, Front Street in Madison, now First and Madison. And this gentleman, John Back, is working in a carpentry shop on the water, and he's mixing a pot of hot glue. And Mr. Back earns this description a little bit later, because as the glue as it's being mixed, it starts to bubble over, and he acts very quickly. He throws water on the glue, causes it to explode, causes that hot glue to spread. You've got sawdust, shavings, dry wood. Next thing you know, Seattle is burned to the ground, sadly. This was our Great Fire of 1889. To me, one of the just wonderful images of the city, really revealing another story. And that story is all the pilings along the waterfront that basically supported Seattle. That without those pilings, we'd be a very different city. But that's whole nother story to go into. But once Seattle burns, the city council passes regulations saying you have to rebuild with stone and with brick. And if you've spent any time in Seattle, one of the curious aspects of the city, for although it is a city that is so much has happened due to its geology, there's basically no good building material at the surface. There's no good rock at the surface. So what happened is that the builders did what they always do, is they seek out the closest sources of high quality material. And they find three sandstone in 3 places, primarily up at North, Chuckanut, Tenino, Wilkeson, and then over in Index, they find a granite. And that granite shows up in this building, several buildings. I just thought this was a really wonderful one to talk about. That granite's about 32 million years old, so relatively young material. A granite is an igneous rock that forms underground, so it's a magma that cools, solidifies underground, and the name granite from granito, meaning sort of granular. I'm sure you've all seen granite. And again, if you've walked by this building, that quarry, the Index quarry, is no longer being used, but walk around Seattle and you will see a good number of buildings made of granite, always at the base of the building. You never see it above the 2nd or 3rd floor. It's always used as a very foundation material at the bottom of buildings. And then this lovely garage system here. There's another geologic feature connected to this garage. I'm sure those of you who walked by have noticed it. And I'll come back to that in a second. But what I want to talk about before, because I forgot the order of my slides, I apologize, is how do you cut stone? How do you shape stone to look like you want it to look like? Well, the way it's done is through what's known as the plug and feather system. And this is a system that's been used since the Egyptians, if not longer. So for a couple thousand years, people have been using this. What you do is you drill a series of holes in your rock like this. You can see them all lined up in this. You then have this 3 pieces of metal, 2 L-shaped ones, and then a wedge. You drop these in, the plug and the feather, into the hole. You pound that until the rock breaks along this zone of weakness. It's sort of like a piece of paper in a notebook. It gets perforated, and that's that zone of weakness, and that's easy to separate. So they would cut the rock this way, and on Queen Anne, you can find rocks that have this, it looks almost like a little clam burrow, this pattern, but it always indicates a plug and feather method. In some environments, instead of using steel or iron, they would actually put a wood wedge in and drip water into it. And as that wood wedge absorbed water, it would help crack the rock. Or in very cold environments, say up in Scandinavia, you put water in these holes, you cap it, and when the water freezes, it expands and breaks the rock. This is the historic way that rock was cut. Now everything is done with diamond tipped saws and big, massive equipment. But walk around Queen Anne and you will see places with these stones with the lovely little pattern in it. To me, it always makes me happy when I see those, because I know that somebody, an individual, cut the rock using this ancient, very ancient and very simple, but very elegant method to cut rock. But let's go back to this building here and the other geological connection. And that geological connection is this gas pump. This is a Bowser gas pump. Sylvanus Freedom Bowser, I believe is his name. And I don't know a lot about it, and I would love if you all knew more in the chat session to fill me in. I don't know whether this is original. It looks to be. This type of pump has been around since the late 1800s, basically 1890s, all the way up to the 1950s. They were using these Bowser pumps. There would have been an underground storage tank. And the gasoline, it's unclear where it came from. I know that supposedly the first gasoline station in the United States, it's debated, was a Standard Oil gas station that opened here with gas coming from California. That would have been the source. My guess is that was the early source for gasoline in the Seattle area. But I would love at the end of the talk if people have additional information about this. But this is the only gas pump that I know of in the city that you can see. And I'd like to think that it's original, but again, happy to chat about it at the end. So continuing thinking our geologic story, as I said, the other material that was used, we had stone and we had brick come in. And that index granite that comes in was often used for early curbs. So Queen Anne, being one of the early neighborhoods, has quite a few granite curbs left. Over time, granite was replaced by concrete. That the early concrete curbs have this metal railing on it. So if you really want to sort of dork out with people, you can tell them, oh, here's the older curb, here's a slightly newer curb, and here's a much younger curb right here. Brick comes into Seattle. Seattle had an extensive brick making industry. That's because of the glacial story. That's because of that clay in the hillsides. They could literally just mine the clay out and use it for making bricks. All along the Duwamish River, they were able to do that. Just simply mine it out. Up in the Cedar River watershed, there was a big brick building facility up there that ties into the story of clay in Seattle. So brick, a very important resource. You mostly see it, I mean, you see it in lots of buildings, obviously, but I always love seeing it along the streets. Again, it makes me happy to think about the stories of that here. And then of course the cobblestones, and I'll come back to that. The other rock that comes into Seattle is sandstone. As I said, Chuckanut, Tenino, Wilkeson, it's all about a 55 million year old sandstone deposited before the birth of the Cascades and the Olympics, when what we think of as the I-5 corridor was oceanfront property. And so rivers washing out of the east dumped sediment into that water area, into the deltas. That sediment accumulated layer upon layer upon layer and produced a sandstone. Sadly, people seem to like to paint over it. I like this shot because you can see the sandstone underneath and then sadly see that it's been painted over. I think that's sort of gross and gauche, but that's me. I'm sort of weird that way. So you still see quite a few sandstone buildings around. You just sort of poke your way around, you'll find them. The other place, of course, where you see sandstone is the cobblestones in the street. I like this street because it has both granite and the sandstone blocks being used. There was a study done, and it's been a while, in the 80s, I think. There are about 90 of these cobblestone streets in Seattle. And technically, as Michael knows, we've had this discussion before, they're not cobblestones, they're actually setts, S-E-T-T. Cobblestones are actually the little cobbles that you see in buildings. These are technically setts. If you really want to, again, dork out, you can, of course, see the brick still here. So there's still a fair number of cobblestone streets on Queen Anne. It's really one of the better places to see them. And they replaced the dirt. They were a good material for use, particularly when you had wagons going over and you had the steel on the wheels. The sandstone was pretty resistant to erosion for that. Then there's the outside stone that's come in to Queen Anne. And probably the best is at the library, or some of my favorite at the library. The library was built, in 1913, and I know that the slate roof has been refurbished. I don't know if this was what was on the original one. Again, that would be a question I have. But this slate, this is the classic slate from upstate New York and Vermont. These were the two states that supplied most of the slate used in the United States. The red in particular came from New York, and the red is known as the Indian River slate. The middle Granville is the greenish or the grayish color, each about 460 to 530 million years old. This is old rock. A slate is a metamorphic rock. So we've got our igneous rock with the granite, we've got our sedimentary rock, the sandstone, and then there's a metamorphic rock. So if you take a rock like, say, a shale, which is fairly fine grained, and you bake it and squeeze it, you can convert it into a slate where all the layers are lined up and it's fairly easy to peel it apart. Another well-known type of metamorphic rock is marble. If you take a limestone, which is a sedimentary rock that is rich in the mineral calcite or calcium carbonate, bake it, squeeze it, you get a marble. And that's certainly what happened in Italy. Probably the most famous marble in the world, the Carrara marble, is a 200 million year old sandstone that was baked and squeezed about 27 million years ago to produce Michelangelo's marble. But you don't see a lot of slate roofs around. There's a handful of them in the city. I know the University of Washington campus, but I would argue this is probably the most lovely of the slate roofs in the city. I just think it's a gorgeous. I love this use of color. Not cheap, but wonderfully beautiful. Then there's this rock, and I've seen this a handful of places in Seattle. I know some up on Phinney Ridge. This 105 million year old limestone. You're probably familiar with this spot, and if you zero in on it, you find that this limestone is filled with fossils. All sorts of different invertebrates lived in probably a sea, some that where lime was settling out, and there were probably some storms in that sea that gathered these organisms sort of all came together, these bits of shells, the gastropods and such. So next time you go to that spot, you can find the fossils. They're easy to find. I mean, this is more or less, maybe this is twice life size, but they're very easy to see. It's a really fun and nifty building to go to. So I really encourage you, if you've never been, to go and find this structure and explore it. So again, this is a limestone or a rock that is made primarily of the mineral calcite. And just to let you know, I'm sure all of you have eaten calcite if you've ever had a Tums. The second ingredient in a Tums is calcite. The first ingredient is sugar. That's why you like eating a Tums. I'm not saying you like to, but that's why you can actually tolerate eating one of these. So let me switch again, gears, move a little bit away from geology and get back to another story that I find really interesting in Seattle. And that is the story of horses. At one point in Seattle, horses meant horsepower. And one thing that would be nice if you had a horse or someone came to your house is a way to tie them up. There are a handful of these hitching posts around the Seattle area. There's a couple up on on Capitol Hill, Millionaires Row. Those are made of granite. These ones are more concrete. So there's a handful of them around, but if you keep looking, maybe you'll find more. I'm always interested in finding features like this. Again, that connection back to the early history of Seattle, that equine history. It's interesting. I've just been doing some research on Lake Union and came across a petition from people who were just north of the lake complaining in 1893 about the cows being too loud in their neighborhood over there. And they petitioned the city to somehow quiet down the cows. Who knows? It was probably about as successful as many things that the city tries to do, but that's a whole nother issue. Then there are the trees. And this is a story I don't know the answer to. And I've talked to Michael about this and asked about it. I'd heard this rumor that there were 4 copper beaches located around Queen Anne that supposedly marked the 4, like at the cardinal directions, or 4 sort of northwest, southeast, southwest, south, and northeast corners. I don't know if it's true, but I do know that there are copper beaches at least 3 of these corners. There's one over here, there's one down here, and there's one up in this corner over here. I don't know of a corresponding one in the southeast corner. But if anyone knows additional information about these beaches, whether this is just a story, this was told to me by a guy who was an arborist who said he'd done some research, and I've never been able to prove it. But I thought I would at least present the story to you so you had it, and so you might go, oh, hey, I know more about this. I can share this with David and we can educate him. Again, for me, it's a conversation. It's about being observant. It's about finding these curious little features. Another tree that I'm sure you've seen around are the Chilean monkey puzzle trees, the Oricoria auricana, a very ancient type of conifer. And they're just, around in a handful of places. Someday, I would love to be able to get down and see a forest of these trees. Can you imagine what it would be like? To me, it's just so cool seeing the ones that are around Seattle, I have no idea why they came into this area. Again, it's one of those questions. Why are these trees here? What's the story? What made them so popular why are they still popular? I mean, I get why they're still popular. They're pretty cool looking. And I want to end by just, again, purely an observation point. For me, I'm, as I said, always interested in finding features on the landscape that are different, that cause me to stop, that cause me to ask questions, cause me to go, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. And animals are certainly one of the features. I love the fact that you can go around and find different animals. These are in the cemetery. This eagle, I assume, because eagles are the dominant birds, horse that I think, or dog, or I'm not sure what you want to call this lovely owl, squirrel at the church of the, I'm sorry, the name is escaping me. I'll get the information if anyone has it. And whatever these are, whether they are, it's hard to tell. What are they? Are they eating? Are they voicing something? I don't know. But to me, it's about observation. It's about slowing down. It's about asking questions. It's about the connections that these observations allow to grow within you. As someone who grew up in the Seattle area and have spent a lot of my time wandering around, to me, one of the greatest things is that ability to develop a stronger relationship to this place. I love Seattle. Anyone who spends time with me knows that I'm very passionate about the city. I know there's all sorts of problems, but I find such joy in being able to find these stories, to find these features and to share them. And to me, it just makes the city more engaging, more wonderful, more enjoyable just for walking around. So I will just sort of leave you with that final thought. Again, I will add, for those of you who are interested, this will be my one sales pitch. If you're interested in any of my books, Maureen mentioned my new one, Home Waters, which takes the deep dive into the human and natural history of Puget Sound. So I will do a stop share and open up the screen and look forward to answering your questions, and I hope learning from you.
Okay. Let me get my camera back on. Sorry.
Hey, Maureen.
Hey, oh, thank you, David. That was fantastic. I learned so much. I now know that there's a name for that water that is always on Bertona around 7th West. It's a seep.
Yes, there it is.
I'm excited for my next walk around the neighborhood.
Great.
Again, you know, you have such a delightful way of seeing the many layers of history and natural history and the built environment. So you've got some questions from our guests tonight. So
so what caused the glaciers to retreat? Climate change. The climate changed and the environment warmed up, and so we weren't getting as much snow accumulation driving the movement of the glaciers. So they stop and they retreat or melt back to the north. So it's clearly it's a temperature issue. Why is there both brick and stone in the streets? I'm guessing probably some of it's aesthetic. I'm guessing that I'm wondering, just thinking out loud, I don't know for sure whether the brick was better in the sort of curb area because water would be able to flow a little bit more. It's less resistant to water flowage, and so better for drainage purposes. Perhaps it could also happen to do with what's available at the time, but I don't. That's a great question.
Like a lot of these other people.
All I know, I don't know how extensive they were, except to know that I said there's about 90 or so left. My guess is much more extensive. And you get a clue every once in a while when they repave streets. I remember being in the U District when they repaved 45th, and they took up all the asphalt or concrete, and underneath it was the original brick. Or the original sandstone. So probably quite extensive. And again, you get little hints into that.
Well, you know, on Queen Anne, if you look at, the boulevard is landmarked. And I have had interesting sometimes oppositional conversations with the landmarks preservation staff, because there are always 7 courses of bricks on each side of the cobblestones. And the landmark nomination protects the 7 courses. So the Department of Transportation has no idea what the hell they're doing when they pave things, and they cover them over. So if you find fewer than 7, you got a problem. So go ahead with the other questions. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. No, thank you. I appreciate that. How cobblestones used in many of our cobblestones from older ships related to ship ballast? Thanks, Elaine. That's a great question. And it's one of the ones that I've been trying to track down the answer. We know, as you point out, that we had a lot of the ships that came into early Seattle had ballast in them because they'd come in, they needed that ballast, and then they would drop their ballast in the city once they had loaded up with goods and head to the south. But much of the cobbles or the ballast came from San Francisco. And I think most of it, from what I've been able to gather, ended up in what became known as Ballast Island in downtown Seattle, roughly West Washington and underneath the Alaskan Way down there. And I've heard rumors of that specific buildings were made with ballast. And being a good historian, I always want to know, what's the source for that information? Do you have written documentation? Do you have contemporary documentation? And I have not found it. That does not mean that it doesn't exist, but I've never found contemporary documentation that states specifically that building A was made with ballast from ship B or something like that. So it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I'm just sort of naturally a skeptic because I've read it so many times, and I always wonder if it really is true. It may be, and I love the idea that it is true, but I haven't been able to prove it. Do the seeps move around through the Lawton clay, or do they tend to stay in one place? My understanding, and I know Bill Leprade probably can tell me better. My understanding is that the water, as it moves down, it hits that permeable layer, heads out by gravity, and there's probably some movement as that connection, that layer gets eroded a little bit. There probably is some, but I don't know a lot about the specifics of the seeps. Bill, is there anything you would add to that? If you can be unmuted. Oh.
Yeah, in general, there is a similar elevation, but there are many crenulations in the top of the clay. And so it pops out at preferential places. But I know from experience that in an earthquake or in particularly rainy years, it can pop out in other places. So you can't absolutely be sure where it's going to pop out in any one year.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. What caused the temperature to change for the glaciers to retreat? My understanding, and I do not pretend to be a glaciologist or fully understand it, is there are some big cycles of the way the planet's tilted that affect that, but I do not want to go down that avenue because whatever I'd say would probably not be the right answer. So does our geology make us especially vulnerable to earthquakes? Well, we are especially vulnerable to earthquakes because we have 3 major earthquake zones in the Seattle area. We've got the 2 of them are caused by subduction. So this idea that when plates interact, different things happen. We're on the North American plate and it's moving a little bit. And then off the coast, there's a plate called the Juan de Fuca plate. That Juan de Fuca plate is very dense. And so when North America and Juan de Fuca hit, the Juan de Fuca plate dives under or subducts the North American plate. That subduction is what causes 2 of our earthquake zones. One out on the coast, you've probably heard of the Cascadia subduction zone. That was the one that got all the hoo-ha with the New Yorker article that said the coast is toast or some writerly junk. You know how writers are. But that's basically Velcroed out on the coast. And periodically that Velcro slips. The most recent time was in January of 1700, massive earthquake. But as that plate dives down, it has a tendency to break up a bit. And when it breaks, you have another earthquake. And that breakage zone happens to be about 30 miles direct below the Puget Lowland. And so that periodically breaks. 2001, 1965, 1945, 49, 45 and 65, 49 and 65, excuse me. So it's happened fairly regularly. Then there's another plate boundary that is due to a very different system going on that we can blame California for. It's complicated, but basically there's a zone of weakness called the Seattle Fault Zone that runs from about Issaquah along I-90 through the stadiums, more or less through West Seattle. That fault periodically breaks an earthquake. The most recent about 1,100 years ago, 20 feet of uplift. So in that sense, we are very susceptible to earthquakes because of the geology, where we have altered the landscape. So the area of the Duwamish tide flats, the area where what I call the two kingdoms are, that area is an area of fill. It's artificial land. And anywhere there's artificial land, there is the potential for that land during an earthquake to shake enough that you get what's called liquefaction. If you've ever been to a beach and you've sort of stood on the sand and shake it a bit and it starts to sort of sink a bit, that's liquefaction. That's definitely problematic in the Seattle area. So short answer, yes, earthquakes are a big deal. Are there any erratics besides politicians in Seattle? Good point, Richard. Yeah, there are definitely. On Queen Anne, I don't know of any, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any. I know there are certainly quite a few around the city. Probably the most famous is the Wedgwood erratic in Wedgwood, but there's others. I just haven't seen them, which doesn't mean that they don't exist. So if anyone has any spot.
Oh, David, the beach out at Discovery Park.
Right, and of course 4 Mile Rock.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Billy. Exactly. Perfect. So that's a classic example of an erratic. And erratics, those of you who don't know, are rocks that were moved by the glacier and then left behind. Probably the most famous erratic is Plymouth Rock. That was an erratic. It still is an erratic. Is it the sand layer that slides, or does the clay layer ever slide? I'm thinking about how you can get a visual on slides at Discovery Park. It's that layer it's a zone of weakness, and so it's sliding on the clay where it's going. So if you go to Discovery Park, particularly go at low tide, the really nice low tide, look back, and you will see where the sliding is occurring on that hillside. The city has tried to contain the seeps and pipes, not always successfully, so they're probably always there to come to this. Yeah, the city has done, there was a big project, interestingly enough, on Magnolia, Works Progress Administration project during the 1930s to try and excavate or sort of cut into the hillside and control some of the seeps. If you've ever walked along Perkins Lane, that's probably the most famous spot for seeps and seep-caused landslides in the Seattle area. But that area, there's just constantly weeping there. If you've ever walked from Queen Anne Hill down from the top of Magnolia Boulevard down the steps to Perkins Lane, and they're just all cattywampus, that's a bit of a sign that the hillside is not terribly stable. And it used to be a little bit more so on the east side of Queen Anne. I think they've done some work on improving that area, but there's certainly seeps all along there. I think that's.
Well, I was going to add something, David.
Okay, great.
Background, and my colleague Leanne Olson knows best. But when the library was redone, was restored, and about that, it's almost 15 years ago, the roof was replaced.
Mm-hmm.
And so you didn't know if it was an old, the slate is still old, but it's new slate compared to the opening of the library at the beginning of the 20th century. Because
Okay.
it's kind of funny because the Queen Anne Historical Society has made a horrible point, and it's a really great point, of not collecting objects, but collecting images and documents about the history of Queen Anne and creating new ones. And the fun thing is that we have 2 slate pieces from the original roof are the only objects in our collection.
Ah, excellent. So the roof was, so Michael, you're saying the roof was originally slate and then it was new slate was added to it.
That's what I meant.
Do we have any pictures of the
Oh,
Boston
look,
Street
Leanne
Bridge?
says it wasn't all replaced. Oh my gosh.
Ah,
She's
very exciting.
misled me.
So where did the new slate come from?
We'll have to find out.
It'd be interesting. For a long time, the only red slate available in the US came from upstate New York. It'd be interesting whether that slate that you all got that was purchased was new, freshly quarried, or whether it was reused slate that had been taken off some other building and cleaned up. I'm not saying it was or wasn't, but I know that certainly happened with sometimes happens.
Then Leanne added that the slate came from the same place in New York somewhere.
Okay, so wherever it came from originally.
Yeah,
Fun.
wonderful. Thank you.
So a question was asked, do we have any pictures of the Boston Street Bridge when the ravine went up farther? I don't know of any, but that doesn't mean has anyone, Bill, do you know, did you ever find pictures?
Well, Maureen's are
Yeah, I've searched. I've not successfully found that, and I've never found a photo of the trestle that was there before the Queen Anne Avenue or North Queen Anne Avenue Bridge either.
Okay.
And the other question, David, for you is, since you're following these geological lines, the trolley went over that trestle. Did it really? Do we have that in that 1918 map?
I've not spent a lot of time looking. I'm intrigued. I mean, it got me thinking about what ones were there. I mean, it's always sort of surprising me where trestles were built in Seattle that we don't think about it now. I mean, the classic one in Madison Valley, there was a trestle there. There was another one going up, I think, towards the Yesler Street line where these street trolleys went was one place that they got built. These big wooden trestles, and they're basically all gone. Most of them are completely gone. We've almost eliminated all of that wooden support system. They just, near on South Lake Union that's now, it had been Amgen. It's now the
steam plant.
Steam plant. They just replaced that wooden trestle system that was there. And there's still one just below on the north side of Queen Anne, just below the I-5 bridge, the Aurora Bridge. There's that little bit of trestle area there. So there's a few of those left, but not much. But it'd be interesting.
Oh, I'm just going to say thank you so much.
Well, it was my pleasure. It was great to share stories. I appreciate all your questions. I appreciate the additional insights on this area. I'll just, again, make my announcement. If my mom says my books are really good, so if you're interested in any of them, either buy them at Queen Anne Books, because it is a fabulous bookstore. You're lucky that you have one of the premier independent bookstores in Seattle. If you want one signed, you can get them through my website. There's a very easy way to do it on a credit card, and I just pop it in the mail, and everyone's happy. And so again, it's been my pleasure.
I'm sure all of our mothers appreciated all the work that we've all done.
And our veterans.
Yes, and our veterans. Yes, very good point. Veterans Day. So.
All right. Thank you very much, David. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
My
Yes.
pleasure. Be well, everyone.
Oh my gosh. Now. Wait a minute, I got to end the recording.